May 1926. Detective Bureau, Chicago Police Department, South State Street. A car pulled up outside just after 8 in the evening. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork and saw a heavy-set man in an expensive overcoat walking through the front doors. Alone, no lawyer, no entourage, hands visible at his sides. It took the sergeant a full 3 seconds to recognize who he was looking at. Al Capone, the most powerful organized crime figure in Chicago, walking into a police station under his own power, on his own feet, asking to speak to whoever was handling the Joe Howard investigation. The room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody in it has a framework for. Officers who had spent years chasing rumors and dead ends, and witnesses who developed sudden amnesia, were now looking at the man at the center of all of it, standing calmly at the front desk, waiting. Capone did not look like a man who had come to confess. He did not look like a man who had come to negotiate. He looked, several officers later said, like a man who had come to get something over with. Behind him, the door swung shut. And what happened over the following 6 hours inside that building would tell you almost everything you needed to know about how power actually worked in Chicago in 1926. Not the power of guns or money, though both were present in abundance. The power of understanding, with total clarity, which threats mattered and which ones didn't. Because Al Capone had not walked into that police station because he was afraid of the police. He had walked in because the alternative was something far worse, and the police station of all places was the safest room in Chicago that night. To understand why, you have to go back 2 days, to the early morning hours of May 8th, 1926, and a man named Joe Howard. Joe Howard was not a major figure in Chicago's underworld. He was a small-time operator, a hijacker who specialized in stealing liquor shipments from larger operations and reselling them through his own channels. A man who survived in the bootlegging economy the way scavengers survive in any ecosystem, by taking small risks against larger predators and hoping the predators were too busy to notice. For a while, that strategy worked. Howard had been hijacking shipments belonging to Johnny Torrio and Al Capone's organization for months, small amounts, individual trucks, the kind of losses that in the scale of Capone's overall operation were closer to an accounting nuisance than a genuine threat. But Howard made a mistake that men in his position often made. He mistook being ignored for being untouchable. He began talking, not quietly, in bars on the South Side to anyone who would listen. Howard had started boasting about the shipments he'd taken, naming names, making the kind of claims that, true or exaggerated, had a way of traveling through the same informal network that carried everything else in Capone's Chicago. Word reached Capone's people. Then it reached Capone himself. And then, on the night of May 7th into the morning of May 8th, Joe Howard was at a bar called the Four Deuces, a club that Capone's organization owned and operated on South Wabash Avenue, drinking with friends, when Al Capone walked in. What happened next depends on which version of the story you believe, and there were several versions because the people who were actually in the room that night had very strong reasons not to remember things clearly. The most consistent account says that Capone approached Howard directly, that words were exchanged, that Howard, who had apparently been drinking for some time and had perhaps convinced himself that his earlier boasting had not reached the ears it had reached, said something dismissive, something that suggested he did not take the situation, or the man standing in front of him, seriously. Capone's response was not measured. It was not the calculated, systematic response that would define his actions in other moments of his career. This was personal, immediate, and violent. He grabbed Howard by the collar. According to multiple accounts, he beat him and then shot him multiple times at close range in front of witnesses. Howard died at the scene or shortly after. The four deuces emptied within minutes. By the time police arrived, there was a body, a pool of blood, on the floor of a club owned by Al Capone's organization, and not a single person willing to say they had seen anything. This was the problem, not the body. Bodies in Chicago bars in 1926 were, in the grim arithmetic of the period, not in themselves a crisis. The problem was the manner of it. A public bar, multiple witnesses, a victim beaten and shot by a man whose face was recognized by nearly everyone in the city. The Joe Howard killing was not a quiet elimination, handled with the kind of precision Capone's organization was capable of when circumstances allowed for planning. It was an explosion of temper in a room full of people, the kind of event that, once it happened, could not be unmade, only managed. And managing it required a very specific kind of calculation. Chicago police, for all the ways the department had been compromised by years of payoffs and political pressure, could not simply ignore a murder that half the South Side had heard about within hours. The Chicago Tribune and other papers were already running stories. The state's attorney's office, under Robert Crowe, was under public pressure to show that even Al Capone was not above the reach of Illinois law. A warrant was issued for Capone's arrest on a charge connected to the Howard killing. And for 2 days, Al Capone disappeared. This was where the story most people knew ended, or thought it ended. Capone goes into hiding, the police search, eventually either he's found or the case quietly dies. Business as usual. But that is not what happened. What happened is that for 48 hours, while Chicago police searched the city for Al Capone in connection with a murder charge, Al Capone was sitting somewhere quiet, with Johnny Torrio and a small circle of his most trusted advisors, doing something that the newspapers covering the manhunt had no way of seeing. He was running calculations, not about whether he would be caught. He understood, with the same clarity, he understood everything else about how Chicago functioned, that the police department's ability to actually locate him if he did not want to be located was limited, and that even if he were arrested, the case against him for the Howard killing rested entirely on witness testimony from a bar full of people who had very strong reasons to have seen nothing. The murder charge itself was, in the most literal sense, the smaller problem. The calculation Capone was actually running concerned something else entirely. While Chicago police searched for him in connection with the Howard killing, word had reached him through his network that another, far more serious situation was developing in parallel, one that had nothing to do with the police department at all. Joe Howard had friends, not powerful friends, not organizationally significant friends, but the kind of friends that mattered in a different way. Men from his own neighborhood, his own circle, men who had grown up with him and who, in the days after his death, were not interested in due process or witness statements or anything the Chicago Police Department could offer. They wanted Capone dead, and they were organizing quietly the same way Capone's own people organized things quietly to make that happen. This was the actual threat, not a courtroom, not a jury. A small group of angry, grieving men with guns and nothing to lose, operating completely outside any structure that could be negotiated with, bribed, or predicted. Capone could manage the Chicago Police Department. He had spent years building the relationships, the payment structures, the political leverage that made the department, for all practical purposes, an institution he understood better than most of the men who ran it. What he could not manage, what no amount of money or political connection could reliably control, was a handful of men acting on raw grief and rage with no organizational discipline and no predictable behavior pattern. Those men were the bigger problem. And the police station, surrounded by uniformed officers, with Capone's whereabouts and movements, a matter of public record the moment he walked through the door, was paradoxically one of the few places in Chicago where Joe Howard's friends could not reach him. This is what Torrio understood, and what he explained to Capone during those 2 days, in the same patient, methodical way he had taught him everything else. The murder charge was a problem that the system could absorb. Witnesses would not testify. The state's attorney's office, for all its public pressure, did not actually have a case that could survive contact with a courtroom, because a case requires people willing to stand up and say what they saw, and nobody who had been in the Four Deuces that night was going to do that. The charge would be filed, processed, and would collapse, not through bribery in any crude sense, but simply because the institutional machinery of prosecution required cooperation from people who had every reason not to cooperate. That was a problem with a known shape and a known outcome. The men hunting Capone for revenge were a problem with no known shape at all, unpredictable, untraceable, in the way that Capone's own organization was untraceable, because grief does not follow the same patterns that business does. And the longer Capone stayed hidden, the longer those men had to plan, to wait, to find an opening. Every day he remained in hiding was a day in which the controllable problem, the murder charge, sat unresolved, while the uncontrollable problem, armed men with a grievance, had time to organize. The solution, when Torrio laid it out, was almost elegant in its simplicity. Walk into the most visible, most documented, most heavily guarded building in Chicago, connected to this entire situation. Turn the controllable problem into something that could be resolved on the spot, in full view, with the full machinery of the system around him. And in doing so, remove himself for the critical hours that mattered from the reach of the uncontrollable one. On the evening of May 8th, 1926, Al Capone walked into the Detective Bureau on South State Street and surrendered. What followed inside that building over the next several hours was, in its way, as revealing as anything else in the entire episode. Capone was processed, questioned. The questioning, by multiple accounts, was almost cordial. He answered questions about his whereabouts in the vague, unhelpful way that men with good lawyers and better relationships answer questions, acknowledging nothing, denying nothing specific, providing nothing that could be used. Detectives who had spent 2 days under public pressure to produce a result now found themselves in a room with the man they had been searching for, and discovered that having him in the room did not actually translate into having a case. The witnesses from the Four Deuces, when contacted again, maintained what they had maintained from the beginning. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, could identify no one. Without witness testimony, the murder charge had nowhere to go. By the early hours of the next morning, less than 6 hours after he had walked through the front doors, Al Capone walked back out of them. No charges filed, no bail required, because there was nothing to hold him on. He had been arrested, questioned, and released, and the entire transaction had taken less time than a long dinner. And the men who had been organizing to find him, who had spent 2 days trying to locate a man who had vanished from his usual haunts, now learned, along with the rest of Chicago, that Capone had spent the night in a police station and had walked out the next morning into a city that knew exactly where he was and exactly how protected he had been the entire time. The window had closed. Whatever opportunity those 48 hours of uncertainty might have offered them had been replaced by the reality that Capone was back in plain sight, in his usual places, surrounded by his usual people, and that the moment of maximum vulnerability, the period when he was hidden, unprotected, and his location unknown even to his own organization's full security apparatus, had already passed. The grief that had fueled the original threat did not disappear, but the conditions that had made it dangerous, surprise, opportunity, an unguarded target were gone, and they did not return. In the months that followed, no attempt was made on Capone's life in connection with the Joe Howard killing. The men who might have tried had missed their moment, and moments like that, once missed, rarely came twice. The Joe Howard case itself faded in the way these cases faded. There was no trial, no conviction. The newspapers moved on to other stories, as newspapers in Chicago in 1926 had no shortage of material to move on to. Capone returned to his usual business, his usual restaurants, his usual routines, as though the previous several days had been an inconvenience rather than the closest he had come in years to a situation that his money and his connections genuinely could not solve on their own. Because that is what makes this episode different from almost everything else in Capone's career. His entire system, the bribed officials, the compromised police captains, the judges who managed dockets favorably, the witnesses who developed convenient memory problems, all of it was built to neutralize threats that came through official channels. Investigations, charges, trials, those were systems, and systems could be managed because systems run on people, and people respond to incentives, and Capone understood incentives better than almost anyone alive. But a handful of grieving men with guns and no organizational structure were not a system. They were not running on incentives that money could adjust or relationships could redirect. They were the one category of threat that all of Capone's careful architecture of bribery and influence simply did not address, because that architecture had been built to manage institutions, and grief does not belong to an institution. What Capone did during those 48 hours, and in the 6 hours that followed his surrender, was recognize that distinction faster and more clearly than almost anyone in his position would have. He did not hide from the police because he was afraid of the police. He emerged from hiding and walked toward the police because the police, with all their compromises and corruption, was still, in that specific moment, a known quantity, a system whose rules he understood and could navigate, while the alternative was a void with no rules at all. He turned the lesser threat into a shield against the greater one. He let the institution he had spent years quietly controlling become, for one night, his protection against the one force in Chicago that his control did not reach. It was not courage exactly, though it required a kind of nerve that few men in his position would have had. It was not desperation, though to an outside observer, unaware of the full picture, it might have looked that way. The city's most powerful gangster, suddenly and inexplicably surrendering to the police he had spent years paying off. It was, in the end, the same quality that had defined every major decision of Capone's career up to that point, and would define the ones still to come. The ability to see past the visible threat to the actual one, to understand that the loudest danger, the police manhunt, the newspaper headlines, the warrant with his name on it, was not the danger that could actually kill him, and that the quiet danger, the one without headlines, without warrants, without any official record at all, was the one that required him to do something that no one watching from the outside would ever fully understand, walk toward the people looking for him, because somewhere else in the city, other people were looking too, and those were the ones he could not afford to be found by.